For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Taylor Fox. This is Cybertide, a Cybercrime Magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com. Joining me today is Mark Sangster, the Chief of Strategy at Adlumin and the author of No Safe Harbor, the inside truth about cybercrime and how to protect your business. Hi, Mark. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, it's my pleasure.
So before we start, can you give us an overview of your first book, No Safe Harbor?
Yeah, absolutely. No Safe Harbor was kind of the culmination, I'd say, of probably 10 years of working with different companies and standing in boardrooms and talking about things like cyber risk and trying to translate ones and zeros into dollars and cents so that, managing partners or board members or executives could understand the consequences of the decisions that they made around things like cybersecurity budgeting and so on. And, where I was struggling was I found that over and over, I was telling the same stories and being challenged by the same kind of questions and misconceptions. And that's what really drove me to write the book, was to kind of tell the stories that don't make the headlines, not the major banks, but the small manufacturing firm or the small healthcare facility that's, shut down by ransomware and what it was like. And that was kind of the idea, to do that as a way of, out of that, reverse engineering some sort of simplified framework that these companies could use to protect themselves.
So you're also coming out with a second book called Cyber Conscious Leadership, a practical guide to protecting your organization against cybercrime. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so cyber-conscious leadership is more about looking at real-life consequences and talking to real people. In the first book, I took the stories that I had been involved in, and I also used some other ones that weren't from cybersecurity, just as a way of sort of discussing the topic in general, then bringing it back once we agreed to all the kind of the factors that go into a specific situation. Whereas cyber-conscious leadership is really sort of saying, what makes the difference between the leaders that stood out during a cyber attack and the ones where we saw sort of greater, more punitive consequences or damages to those companies when they were attacked? So I interviewed executives and leaders, so C-suite members, board members, and so on, who had been in companies or organizations that had been attacked. I also interviewed journalists in the Ukraine, in the Donetsk province, people who hire cyber criminals, law enforcement, government agents, and so on. And so the idea there was to really get this 360-degree view of just what the heck is going on, to get in the mind of the bad guys, to understand why they're doing it, how they go about doing it, and then kind of translate that again back to like, okay, so when you were the CEO sitting there and your organization had been shut down with ransomware and you were making the decision to pay a ransom, what was going through your head? How did you make that decision? Who did you gather around you? What factors and pieces of information did you need to make an informed decision? Things like that. So this is really, whereas the original was kind of the tales from my trench per se, this is the one about, opening the aperture and kind of expanding to look at a more broader consideration of all of the, like I said, all of the actors on the stage when it comes to cybercrime.
So let's discuss the second chapter in your second book, where you explore how cybercriminals are adapting their strategies. What is the most important trend you've noticed in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that we're always playing is a cat and mouse game, right? It's, we build a better trap, they come up with a better lock pick, then we have to come up with a better trap, and we go back and forth and back and forth. And so we still see a lot of what I would call living off the land. That's just a generalized category of tactics that use our own tools and technologies against us. So, for example, we see things like multi-factor authentication, right? When you log into a service, there'll also be somewhere else where you go and you've got a second factor you have to input, whether it's, a 6-digit password or a piece of information or something along those lines, right? And they've gotten really good at bypassing those kind of tools and tricking us into thinking we're logging into those systems when we're actually not. And so they can get our credentials, they can get that token, right, that authenticates us. But even more than that, they can take some of the pieces of the data that's transferred between the service that authenticates and your browser or whatever it might be, and they could steal that too. So now anywhere in the world, they look exactly like you. And what's worse is it's almost like having your ID badge. So the guards look at it and go, oh, you have this ID, you're already cleared. It makes this assumption. So we see a lot of that. But, in more broad terms, cybercrime is still increasing exponentially. We are seeing larger gangs, more organized crime. Certainly since Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, I certainly think there's been a gloves off kind of approach, right? We've always been in this Cold War, kind of like a cyber Cold War, where, as long as it stayed below the boiling point, no one was going to start launching rockets and missiles and invade any country. But it's certainly intensified, right? So any sort of Russian affiliated organization has a free hand to go after the West. And I've also seen an uptake from other countries that are looking at not necessarily things like ransomware and extortion, where they're looking at a financial gain, or I should say an immediate financial gain. We're also seeing a lot of espionage increase, right? So you're seeing that from places like China as an example, where they're stealing that information. And then, that in a longer sense, because it's kind of a long game, gains them an economic advantage, or worse, really, it detracts from our economic gains. So, think about medtech company, for example. If their technology is stolen and now there's a counterfeit version of it, they might lose, 20, 30% of the global value of that product.
How did the WannaCry outbreak in 2017 and the COVID-19 pandemic influence the rise and evolution of ransomware attacks?
Yeah, WannaCry, I think, was probably one of the first attacks that moved from what I would call individual targets, right? So I used to joke, it's like, grandma's laptop gets shut down and she has to pay $500 in cryptocurrency to get back pictures of her grandkids and her tax returns. WannaCry kind of shifted to going after organizations, right? So now we were going after law firms and shipping firms and banks and governments and so on. And that was a big shift, right? So this tool that was being used on a small scale sort of took an order of magnitude leap of maybe 2 orders of magnitude. And suddenly it's not 10, now it's 1,000. And what we saw because of that was that the ransom payments went up significantly. So we weren't paying 500 in crypto anymore. Now we were paying 5 million in crypto. And I think that was probably NotPetya, WannaCry, that kind of era was the first stage of it becoming commercialized, where I think the organizations of crime, those syndicates, it almost like industrialized what they did. And then with things like COVID-19, where we saw another shift, is that it's like we had the tectonic kind of shift of, work from home or shelter from home. And a lot of companies just weren't ready for it. So what happened is we kind of got used to the WannaCry era, where it's like, all right, we got to harden everything in our defenses in our corporate environment, and we have firewalls and we limit access. And suddenly we changed the landscape and people are working from home. And so all those defenses we built were kind of useless, right? Because what we did was we built a stronger, taller fort, and all of a sudden no one's in the fortress anymore. Everyone's out in the wild in their own homes, and none of that had been hardened, right? So they hadn't invested in things like remote access tools, like a VPN, right? A virtual private network that encrypts traffic back and forth, or multi-factor authentication. And what was worse even was that a lot of the home technology we use, it's consumer. It is not hardened, and it is not built to the same level of commercial technology. So when you think about that modem that you get from your ISP that allows you to connect to the internet, we worry about things like your connection speed, right? That's our only concern. We don't think about, well, how do we secure it? And that's the problem with those things, is a lot of them are just in their default setting, right? And, any listener can do this right afterwards. Go Google Verizon's router, default administrator passwords. Or, I'm just picking on Verizon, pick anybody, Comcast, Rogers, Telefonica, right? Telstra, like I'm kind of going around the globe here, and they're all going to be, admin or something pretty close. And so it's easy for these characters to get in, deploy malware that it allows them to then collect everything that's going on that device, or gives them a backdoor into that device. And so suddenly you have this corporate activity that we felt was protected now isn't protected, right? And they had free reign access. So it really was a shift in the mindset of companies around what are we protecting? And at the end of the day, the analogy I use for this is we used banking mentality, as in we build a big brick building, we have locked windows and locked doors and guards and a timed vault that you can only access during certain times of the day. And at the end of the day, it's like we put all our money into protecting or building the vault and the building. What we really wanted to protect was the money, right? Like that was, the assets in the bank were what mattered. And so suddenly when those assets were outside, we were still trying to protect it like it was a vault. And we were missing the point of, where the front line was, where the greatest risk was the identity of the individual who had access to those assets. And that's where you've seen a big shift more recently with tools and technology that start to focus more on that. So they care less about where they are and more about who they are and what they're doing.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
Adlumin Inc. provides enterprise-grade security to mid-market organizations. Its security operations platform and managed detection and response services combines all your data into one view to illuminate security risks and accelerate security workflows. Security teams are often stretched thin and are faced with increasing threats to respond to, like ransomware and data theft. Adlumin's patented technology simplifies these challenges by providing organizations with machine learning detection and automated response capabilities to halt threats quickly. The platform also includes threat hunting, automated incident response, vulnerability management, honeypots, darknet exposure monitoring, compliance reporting and monitoring, and more. Join the conversation and see how Adlumin can enhance your security program without increasing your workload. Visit adlumin.com.
And now, back to the podcast.
So as we covered, ransomware is clearly not static. It's evolving. How is this threat changing, and what steps can companies take to better prepare themselves for potential attacks?
Yeah, for sure. So ransomware, we talked about WannaCry and NotPetya and a few of the others. And, besides the fact that the targets have changed, ransomware's gotten a lot better. The toolkits have gotten a lot better at evading defenses. So, for example, I just dealt with a case where a financial institution was targeted, and some of the endpoint technology that they had from a very well-known vendor, and by the way, this technology is very good, right? I would highly recommend it. That said, the ransomware was able to evade detection through those tools, and it was only caught later. So 6 systems were locked down. Think 6 laptops. But they're really good at, one, evading. The other thing is that we see, as I talked about this industrialization of cybercrime, is we see a lot of sort of as a service. So the bigger ransomware organizations will sell their tools just like we would have any other SaaS service, right? Like whether it's a streaming service to record podcasts or, customer tracking or like Microsoft 365, anything like that in the cloud, they're doing the exact same concept. So what that means is, one, you've got better and better technology because, of course, they're making revenue off of that, which they're then investing in that technology. But two, it makes it simple, right? It makes it easier for other criminals to get in the game because they don't necessarily have to have sort of the caliber of expertise to build that technology, right? They can go buy it off the shelf, literally pay a license just like you and I would. We don't have to build a word processor to write a letter. We can, we go to Microsoft and we pay a license fee and we're off to the races. And it's the same kind of thing for criminals. In terms of attacks, in terms of the damage we're seeing, I think that has gone up significantly and will continue to. So we've moved from single extortion where we lock down your system and say, pay us a fee to get the decryption keys, to we're going to do that. Plus, on top of that, we're going to want to get another fee to prevent us from accessing or publishing, I should say, the stolen information that we have. So they're kind of doing this double or dual type of attack. And I think there'll be a third one, right? A third one is leaking it publicly in other ways, notifying regulators if you're a regulated entity, right? Like a healthcare facility or a bank or something along those lines. Notifying customers, we've seen a lot of that. So if the company doesn't want to pay, then they'll send the customer their own information and say, hey, we're bad guy, group XYZ, and we broke into your vendor, and here's all your confidential information, which you can imagine is going to make for a very difficult conversation between that client and that vendor. So we're seeing a bunch of that. And I actually predict that the next stage we're going to see is going back to personalized 1970s movie type of extortion, the sliding the envelope across the diner table and, with the compromising photographs saying, you're going to pay me $50,000 or we're going to tell your spouse. And I think that kind of thing is going to reoccur because what's happening is companies are putting, or governments are putting policies in that say, look, if you take state funding as an example, you can't pay a ransom. Or the company may say, we're a large company and we have decided by policy that we don't negotiate with terrorists, therefore we refuse to pay a ransom. Or we have insurance and we'll cover it up to some point. And so for those reasons, I think criminals will find new ways to extort and get people to pay, right? And that may come down to the executives themselves, where they say, hey, I've taken a look at your personal bank account. I know you have this money, or I know where your kids go to school. And I remember years ago seeing something like that, where a well-known manufacturer that has a very well-known consumer product was hit, and that's exactly what happened. And when they weren't paying money, they actually had information about, well, here's where your kid goes to private school, and here's when they get picked up, and here's when they're dropped off. And you can imagine any parent, right? That's going to have the hairs on the back of your neck rising, because whether it's just a threat or whether it turns into something real, that's a terrifying proposition. So I think criminals are going to kind of continue to move in that direction because that's the way that they continue to prop up the extortion fees that they're getting.
Yeah, that sounds extremely personal, especially when talking about people's children.
Absolutely, right? And remember, at the end of the day, they're criminals, right? They're kind of beyond the law. They are not working to some ethical bound. And in fact, part of the research in the second book, Cyberconscious Leadership, was interviewing people like that, like people who hired criminals, people who are working there. And there's kind of two choices they have, right? First, they can make about 10 to 15 times the amount of money working in a criminal organization than they would in a, let's call it, quote unquote, legitimate organization. And secondly, if that sort of carrot isn't good enough, there's the stick behind it. What do you do when you're in a politically destabilized zone like eastern Ukraine, Donetsk province, or Crimea, or somewhere like that? And, this group says, hey, you're smart with computers. I want you to break in and do this thing for me. And, if you do, we're going to pay you. But by the way, if you don't do that, you and I are probably going to have a lonely walk down a road and I'm going to come back and you're not. And, it's things like that that are still going on. So one way or another, right, whether it's the carrot of reward or it's the stick of some kind of eternal punishment, that's why they're doing it. So you've got to remember that. In some cases, they're very politically or ideologically aligned as well. So they don't see it as a crime. Right? They see this as they're a warrior fighting a war. And this is just, if you're Russian, this is, well, the West has, put all these sanctions on us and it's not right. And whatever propaganda or truth you want to believe, that's what they're doing. If you're in China, this is part of your state duty. And we've seen this again and again and again, right? In fact, north of the border in Canada, one of the assistants to a senior political person has just been arrested as an agent to China, right? Like these things will continue to happen.
So, circling back to your book, you mentioned when discussing cybercriminals that they aren't gangs or operatives, they're organizations. They have more in common with a global intelligence agency than they do with a group of thugs. Cybercriminals are increasingly more sophisticated than we acknowledge. What problems can arise when businesses or individuals underestimate the capabilities of groups like Lockbit?
Yeah, so that's a point that I really wanted to stress in the book. So thank you for raising that. That's it. When we talk about a gang, we think about a bunch of thugs holding down their neighborhood territory, right? That's not what these guys are. I jokingly call them the Misfortune 500, or ironically call them that. They operate like large organizations, right? They have executive structures, they have compensation and recruiting and all of the kind of things that any large organization in the West would also have. So you have to recognize that in many cases, they're probably better funded than you are, particularly if you're a small to medium-sized business. And those, by the way, tend to be the majority of the victims, not the big banks, not the airlines and the hotel chains and the things that we tend to read about. Those make the news, right? Because they have an international brand. It's like I said, it's small law firms. It's the healthcare facility in Midwest Texas. It's the manufacturer in Minnesota that no one's heard of because they make components for some other product that you've heard of. Things like that. They're the ones that kind of suffer. And because they don't have a regulatory issue or because they're this unknown kind of quantity, they don't end up in the press. So we don't read about them. We don't sort of, have the opportunity to learn vicariously. What organizations have to realize is these guys are well-funded, well-structured, and they know how to use your own tools against you. So it's not as I joke, when they show up, in your inbox or at your front door, it is not the, streaming service telling you that your payment method has been rejected and to click on the link to update your credit card info. It will be far more sophisticated and likely they're already using information that's been stolen. So you're going to receive an email from a colleague, from a trusted person in your ecosystem who's going to say, hey, I just saw this new document about this thing that relates to our industry. And you say, hey, Mark, thanks so much for sending that. And they're off to the races. You've opened the doc because it came from a trusted source. So they're much smarter than you think in those terms. They do a good job of conducting reconnaissance, understanding what your industry looks like. What are the buzzwords? What's the blood that pumps through your business, right? That matters to you? What assets matter to you? What regulators do you have? All those kind of issues. And once they know those sort of touch points, they use that to construct campaigns. And they're really, really good at subtly moving around in your environment. Now, the good news is they move around in your environment and they touch a lot of stuff. And that, if you know what you're doing, gives you the opportunity to recognize that something's going on and identify suspicious activity, potentially run it to ground and contain it before it becomes business disrupting.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, I really want to thank the people in the book, Cyberconscious Leadership, that I interviewed. A lot of these people are quite brave, right, for kind of coming forward. And, they have served our country. They are still serving our country. They are people who have certainly suffered these kind of attacks. And if there's one thing I can say, if we can get some piece of good out of the bad that has occurred, is to learn the lessons, right? Not repeat them. And I think that's what's really important here. And that's why, like I said, I kind of wanted to give voice to the voiceless and give them an opportunity to, talk about what they experienced, what happened. And they all kind of give advice about, here's what I would do if I were to face this again. And I think that is invaluable because in cybersecurity, right, we don't have public inquiries and we don't necessarily have some kind of regulatory investigation, say like an aircraft crash, where we get to find out what all the factors were and learn from it and rules and regulations get changed because of it. The majority of these attacks occur in the dark. We don't know about them until it's too late. And, that's one of the advantages criminals have. So let's turn on the lights and take that away.
Can you tell our audience where they can buy your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So Cyber-Conscious Leadership should be coming out late this fall, and it will be available on all of your online outlets, as you can imagine, right? So Amazon is an example. It will be available there for download, and there'll be a digital copy and also an audio copy as well.
Great. Thanks, Mark.
You're very welcome.
For Cybercrime Radio, I'm Taylor Fox. Joining me today was Mark Sangster, the Chief of Strategy at Adlumin and the author of No Safe Harbor, the inside truth about cybercrime and how to protect your business. Cybertide is a Cybercrime Magazine podcast series brought to you by Adlumin. Working to revolutionize the way organizations secure sensitive data, Adlumin finds the newest cracks being exploited and shines a light on correcting the issue in real time with expert guidance. To learn more about our sponsor, visit adlumin.com. That's ADLUMIN.com. For more of our media, visit our website at cybersecurityventures.com.